Welcome to the Grassroots Advocacy Training. My name is Jacob Pace. I'm the Communications and Grants Coordinator at Interfaith Peace Builders. It's wonderful to see you all here this morning. And I'm looking forward to a great day of events and a very active day of constituent grassroots lobbying tomorrow. You guys all stoked? Yes! So I want to go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, and that is Nadia Hijab. Nadia is the co-director of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and a writer, public speaker, and media commentator. Nadia has served as co-chair of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation and currently sits on its advisory board and is past president of the Association of Arab American University Graduates. So please welcome Nadia Hijab.
When Jake first asked me to speak about, the topic for the talk today is Israel, Palestine in the age of Obama and the Tea Party. And I thought, gosh, that's a bit of a mouthful. But then, when the Arab revolutions started succeeding one another and scored some amazing successes, I thought, well, you know what? This is a pretty inspired choice of topic, because it really makes us think about what's happening over here and how it relates to what's happening over there. And for me, it really reaffirms that some of the most valuable work that we can do is over here, and that the change that we make, any change that we make over here, will not only be good for justice for Palestinians and equality for Palestinians and Israelis, but also good for justice and equality for Americans. And in fact, many Americans are pointing out the similarities between what's going on in the Middle East and here. And I know you've all heard about how the protesters in Wisconsin have been holding up these signs saying Hosni Walker or Scott Mubarak. And as Heidi Morrison, who's a professor, in fact, at the University of Wisconsin, wrote recently in Le Monde, the decision to criticize the Wisconsin governor through an angle of dictatorship sends a message. Americans don't have a corner on democracy. And in fact, she wrote about her Egyptian friend in Cairo who had emailed her and said, hey, we're happy to export the Egyptian revolution. Americans can come over here for training, he said. So that's a good feeling for a change. So I want to say that in their new and sustained struggle for democracy, people in Arab countries understand that democracy is not just about having elections every 4 years, even when those elections are free and fair, which they never are really in the Middle East, and they haven't been here in the recent past. Democracy is a way, it's a mechanism, it's a tool, it's really not the objective. It's a way to make sure that people have the minimum they need to live in dignity and to have a say in how they're governed and how their money is used. Democracy is really a way to make the link between political, economic, and social rights, between bread, dignity, and freedom. And that's what the Arab revolutionaries are calling for. And I think what the comparison between Egypt and Wisconsin tells us is how incomplete democracy is in America. How real is democracy here when so many people have lost their homes due to unfair and illegal foreclosure? How real is democracy when our money is used to bail out banks that pay no taxes while people lose their jobs and see their essential services just decimated? What kind of democracy has the largest prison population in the world, with one race disproportionately incarcerated? And what kind of democracy drags its people into illegal wars abroad or funds dictatorship, apartheid, and occupation? So, we have a long way to go with this democracy thing. And in fact, I've never forgotten something that a labor organizer said to me, or said, in fact, to the group back in 2001, at one of the very first meetings that sowed the seeds of the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation, which, as Jake mentioned, I'm a co-founder, and I'm very proud to have been a co-founder. And this labor organizer said, I think back, and if we Americans had stayed mobilized after the Vietnam War, we wouldn't have to remobilize today. And if you look back, you think how many times we've had to remobilize and over how many causes we've had to start from scratch all over again. And in fact, if Americans had remained mobilized for their rights after Vietnam, ask yourself if the Bush regime would have been able to launch that war against Iraq in 2003. So we really do have our work cut out for us. But there is good news. More than ever before, this is a time, we're in a time and a place that we can make a difference. And the even better news is all the education that we've all been doing over the past decade and beyond about America's work and about America's role in the Middle East has now contributed to a major shift in discourse. So today, we really have fertile ground to change US policy at home and abroad. And we have a way, we have the opportunity to work for freedom, justice, and equality in a way that will be sustainable, that will make us strong enough to challenge forces that deny human rights now and in the future. So how do we go about making that difference? First, we need a firm foundation to work from. When everything's changing around us, when there's so much going on, there's so much to process now, it's really hard to process. We need an especially firm foundation if we want to build lasting structures for justice, peace, and equality. And the firmest foundation we have, and I'm going to spend a little time on this, the firmest foundation we can have is the foundation of human rights and international law. Now, some people's eyes tend to glaze over when you say those words, human rights and international law, think, oh God, not that. But the principles are actually very simple. And what's more, they're very easy to grasp because they're principles and values that everybody in the world understands. If you go anywhere, you will hear the word dignity. The belief in human dignity is universal. You'll hear that word whether you're in Cairo, whether you're on occupied Palestinian land, whether you're among the poor in Bangladesh or in the poor in New York or in Mexico, wherever you are, people will talk, we want dignity, we want to be able to live in dignity. And I've always thought it's ironic that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was in fact adopted by the United Nations in 1948, exactly the same year that Israel was created and Palestine disappeared off the map in a conflict that is still with us today. The core principle of human rights and of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is dignity. And other than that, it's grounded in the same principles and values that we all hold dear. And in fact, when they came together to work on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they looked at all religions and philosophies to try and pull together principles that would be universal, that every human being everywhere would be able to relate to. And what the Universal Declaration tells us is, okay, here are the minimum standards that we need to be able to live in dignity. Now, the reason why the Universal Declaration is so important is because it's not just a nice sounding document. In fact, it's a fantastic sounding document, and I encourage you to read it. But it's not just that. Its principles have been translated into law, into international law, which have been signed by several countries all over the world, including this country. Actually, this country has signed many of those international laws. Unfortunately, it hasn't signed enough. It hasn't signed the Women's Convention, the Convention for Women's Rights. It hasn't signed the Convention for Children's Rights. And this is crucial, it has not signed the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So, like I said, there's a lot of work to be doing here because the economic, social, and cultural rights tells us what are and there's also a Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which America has signed. But you need all these rights in order to be able to know what are the minimum standards that we need to live in dignity. For example, the right to food, the right to housing, the right to health. Actually, some countries have gone further. In the Philippines, in their constitution, they have a right to electricity. And when you first think about it, you think, that's a bit weird. But actually, where would we be without electricity? Our whole world would come to grind to a halt. And the fact that US leaders have traditionally not believed in economic, social, and cultural rights is a major reason why this country is an incomplete democracy. So, what's really important is that the Universal Declaration for Human Rights has been translated into international law. And when countries sign those international law, when they sign an international convention, they give it the power of domestic law in their own country. So you can, as a citizen of that country, have the protection of those international laws. And I think we in the United States, we need those international laws that the US has not signed just as much as any other country, because it's easier to subvert or to change domestic law. Look what happened to civil liberties in this country after, after 2001, after the September 11 attacks. Civil liberties were subverted. But then it's much harder to change international law because you have to get the agreement of 184 or whatever they are, number of countries, members of the United Nations, and we can use that protection. So I think the reason I'm spending a little bit of time on this is I think that any movement that wants to achieve freedom, peace, and justice has to invest just a little bit of time in educating people about international law and human rights and its meaning for their lives. So not to educate people about it in the abstract, but to say why this matters to you in your life. And there's many advantages to such an education. First of all, the same set of laws applies to foreign policy as it does to domestic policy. So you're not talking just about poverty in the third world, you're also talking about poverty at home. You're not talking about racism and discrimination in Israel, but also at home. And so on. So investment in education about human rights, international law, pays off. Applying international law and talking about human rights can really help us deal with the rise of right-wing forces in the United States, including those in the Tea Party. When people really understand international law and human rights, then you don't have to say much more. For example, if people really knew what the law was, all you would have to say, well, the war against Iraq is illegal. It's against the law. There is no such thing under the law as the international law as a preventive war. And so that's all you'd have to say. But of course, because that investment hasn't been made in people's knowledge, then we have to start from scratch and we have to make all kinds of arguments about why that war was wrong. And I'm sure you've been through those excellent resources that have been put together for you by Interfaith Peace Builders and the US campaign for this weekend. And if you look at them, all they're asking is for the US government, the US representatives, to apply US law. That's what we want. Just apply the law of the land to what you're doing. When a country uses US arms outside its border, like Israel does, it's breaking the law. When US-based charities are funding militias that kick Palestinians out of their homes and off their land, that's breaking the law. So the law is a powerful argument that it's uncomfortable for governments to say, oh, well, you know what, we don't really want to apply the law. It's a powerful argument that we can use. And so I put it to you, how much more powerful would our movement be if we also held the US government accountable for international law, at least the ones that it's signed? For example, for its illegal war on Iraq. For example, for the way Israel violates the Geneva Conventions, which make it illegal to move your population into an occupied territory. I think you probably all remember that in 2004, the International Court of Justice passed an advisory opinion on Israel's separation wall, or its apartheid wall, depending on what term you prefer, that it's building illegally in the West Bank. And the International Court of Justice, the highest authority on the planet, legal authority on the planet, called on all countries not to support Israel's wall and its associated regime. And actually, the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice has been used in a case against the British government to stop it exporting arms to Israel, and they have stopped the export of some arms to Israel. So in some cases, it works. So first, if we want to achieve change, our first step should be to make that investment in the foundation of human rights and international law. Our second step is to educate, educate, educate. It's true there's been a big shift in the discourse, and many people know a lot more now and reject Israel's human rights violations of the Palestinians, but the shift in discourse hasn't gone far enough. We should let no opportunity pass for education, no opportunity. And whether through writing letters to the editor, by demanding media coverage, by speaking to groups, whether small groups or large groups or one person, or by undertaking creative and eye-catching actions like a flash mob, or actually Code Pink is very creative with this, so speak to them. And all these are opportunities to for education. Even when something goes wrong, even when you don't succeed, you've had a good opportunity for education. And when we educate, what a great opportunity to make the link between the way our government spends its money on wars and on dictators and on gross violations of human rights by its allies, beginning with Israel, and on the one hand, and how this money can be used at home on the other. There's some excellent materials in your information packet that give very good examples of the way in which your tax dollars, my tax dollars, can and must be better used at home, whether on green jobs or housing or in many other ways. How criminal is it? How absurd is it that one of the richest countries in the world, Israel, gets over $3 billion in military aid from the United States in order to dominate and colonize another people? So this is something that a message we really need to get out. So first, that firm foundation of human rights and international law, and second, educate, educate, educate. Third, and perhaps most importantly, we need to act to change US policy in the Middle East. Changing US policy towards the Israel-Palestine conflict is so important that it has been, in fact, the core mission of the US campaign to end the Israeli occupation since it was founded. We need to keep asking the questions that count. Why is the US supporting Israel's violations of American as well as international law? Why doesn't the US make Israel stop right now from swallowing up East Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley? Not to say anything about all the other violations. How can a country like the US that claims that all citizens are equal at home, and I say claims, all citizens are equal at home, support Israeli apartheid and in the occupied territories and discrimination against the Palestinian citizens of Israel? And why has the US been supporting, and why does it still support, Arab dictators all over the world? Another question we could add is, why is the US supporting the establishment of exactly the kind of regime that you see in the Arab world in the Palestinian occupied territories? Why is it doing that? Even as it's supporting, why does it support the blockade of Gaza? Our movement faces a dilemma when it comes to the Ramallah-based PA, as well as to the Gaza-based PA. Our movement faces a dilemma. There's a huge gap now between those that claim to lead the Palestinian people and the aspirations of the Palestinian people. So what do we do here in the United States? Do we try to side with the Palestinian people against the PA? Or do we attack one side? Do we attack Fatah? Or do we attack Hamas? Or do we attack both? What do we do? So it's up to, I think, every individual to follow her or his conscience. But as a movement, our work is protected by two things. First, the framework of international law. The Palestinians have inalienable rights. Inalienable rights. It's not an easy word to pronounce, but it's a pretty critical word. And what it means is no one can sign your rights away. They're yours. And so the Palestinians have a right to self-determination, and they have a right to return to their homes that no one can take away from them. And so all we have to do is, whatever happens, we keep speaking up for those rights. And we speak up against anyone that violates human rights. So that's the first thing that protects our movement from having to engage with this issue. And the second thing that protects our movement is our primary role as Americans, and where we can make the most difference is to hold this government, our government, accountable for its policies. That's our job. You know, it's up to Palestinians to take on their leaders or those who claim leadership. It's up to us to say to our government, you know, your policies do not uphold the law. So of all countries around the world, it is this country that most needs to change its policy towards Israel and the Palestinian people. And we, the citizens of the United States, carry the biggest responsibility of all peoples around the world for changing this country's policy. As we recently saw in the veto the US exercised at the UN against the resolution simply saying that settlements are illegal, you know, which, hey, they are. So the US vetoed that resolution, even though it is a reflection of US policy. It vetoed the resolution, and it was alone amongst all the nations on the Security Council. So what does that tell us? It tells us that more than any other country on earth, the US is preventing accountability for Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, which is why Israel gets away with murder, as it has done for over 60 years. And given the military aid that the US gives to Israel, we, you and I, more than any other people on earth, are paying for Israel's occupation. So without America's military and diplomatic aid, the blind eye our government turns to those charities, so-called charities that fund the settlements and the dispossession of the Palestinians, Israel would not be able to maintain its occupation. It simply would not. So changing US policy is the most strategic work that we can do if we want to make a difference in the Middle East. So our work here this weekend is very important indeed. The US political system still gives people access to their representative. And if they want to be re-elected, they have to listen to their constituents. And when enough people demand a change in US policy towards Israel, that change will happen. And the way to do this is to support the campaigns of candidates that support a just peace, and to withhold money and votes from candidates that don't. And you know, by the way, it doesn't take a lot of money to have an influence with a candidate. About $500 or $1,000 will do it. You know, so you could raise that amount in a house party. It's not a lot of money. But our success really depends on growing our numbers, not just by allying with other activists for a just peace in the Middle East, but also allying with groups working for justice at home, for immigrant rights, for fair housing, for prison reform, for jobs, for the right to unionize. When we make these alliances, when we work with those allies at the district level, and I see you all have tags that say what district you're from, when we work with allies at the district level, we will be a powerful force for change. And you know what? The skills that we'll be learning today here and that we'll be using tomorrow, they're transferable skills. So we have a lot to share with allies. And of course, we have a lot to learn from them. There are many American groups working on different aspects of justice and peace in Palestine and Israel, whether it's boycotts and divestment, whether it's ending the blockade against Gaza, whether it's stopping home demolitions, and so on. Solidarity visits, and all this is very important. But changing US policy by pushing for ending military aid to Israel and by seeking an end to the US veto to block international action, this is where we can make the most strategic difference. I just want to caution, and I'm almost finished, so don't panic. I just want to caution against one argument, which is, and you hear this a lot, which is that the US will not be able to fulfill its objectives in the Middle East unless it changes its policies towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. America's military commanders are warning about this all the time. You know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we have to solve it, otherwise we can't fulfill our objectives in the Middle East. Well, let's step back a moment. What are those objectives, you know, in the Middle East? So we have to be very careful with this line of argument, because US interests in the region are generally, and we've seen that, and it's a fact, are diametrically opposed to the security, peace, and progress of the peoples of the region. what the US is doing in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Iran, and in Arab countries needs to be exposed for what it is. It's not doing anybody favors for human rights. No, it's a projection of US empire. And there's many people that have written very powerfully about this that you can read as we seek to make the links between military adventurism abroad, US support to Israel, and the disastrous state of our schools and our workforce and our cities. So I think working together, we can do these three things. We can build our movement on the firm foundation of human rights and international law. We can educate about Israel's violations of human rights of the Palestinian people, as well as about how US actions at home and abroad run against international law. And we can act to change US policies that deny freedom and that support apartheid and injustice abroad and at home. We're really living through historic times. The Arab revolutions have kind of punched a hole in the wall of hypocrisy and double standards that have prevented progress. And Arabs are demanding their rights, and their voices are being heard and inspiring people everywhere, including in these United States. And I think by adding our voice to theirs, we can bring about a new dawn of freedom, justice, and equality. Thank you very much.